morning and good afternoon, dear conference participants. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. Although we are not face to face, nonetheless, thanks to technology, we can meet virtually all together. My presentation today will look at briefly at the institution I represent, with the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. Its thematic approach to media and minorities over the years, as well as our reaction to the current COVID-19 crisis. And I'll briefly try to look at some of the questions posed before our panel, specifically regarding Central Asia, and hopefully this will be a useful start of the questions and answers and discussion we will have together later on. Now, briefly about the OSCEHRCM. It was established in 1992 as part of the wider OSCE family as an instrument to address interethnic tensions and conflict, both between and within OSCE participating states. So the HCNM has a wide prevention mandate, and it tends to operate at a quiet diplomacy level. I know that for journalists that's sometimes complicated, but the reason for that is to build the necessary trust between the authorities and national minorities. We sometimes do issue press releases on our work, but the HCNM has a varied toolbox. This includes country visits by the High Commissioner herself or himself. And usually visits are done at quite a high level, meeting with the authorities, but also groups representing national minorities, as well as civil society more generally. And not only in the capital of countries that the High Commissioner visits, but also in those regions which may be more densely populated by national minorities. We also provide legal advice to draft laws or to policies on integration matters, as well as a whole host of thematic recommendations, which are based on the best practices that the High Commissioner sees across OSCE participating states. And these recommendations and guidelines are addressed to these participating states, as well as other stakeholders in the different societies of the wider OSCE area. Now, our thematic approach is one of the most important parts of our work, because generally speaking, we try to promote the integration of diverse societies in order to foster social cohesion. And therefore, when we talk about the media, this means that we look at it from a conflict prevention point of view, as well as a peace-building perspective. So it's a more structural, long-term engagement to help the good processes which are already there. And in this sense, it is also complementary to the more rights-based approach taken by the RFOM, for instance, with whom we cooperate quite regularly. Already back in 2003, the HCNM issued guidelines on the use of minority languages in the broadcast media, and with the intention to ensure access of national minorities to broadcast media in their language. I will provide links to this guideline later on, but I can quickly summarize these guidelines by saying that they, first of all, reassert the principle of the freedom of expression, including of persons belonging to national minorities, and focuses on the need for cultural and linguistic diversity, which should be protected by creating an environment in which ideas and information can flourish and can be communicated in various languages, including in minority languages. And this is important for the protection of identity of every member of society, including national minorities, as well as to uphold the principles of equality and non-discrimination, which is one of the topics of discussion for the panel today. How can this be done? This can be done through policies, and in this regard, states should develop policies to address the use of minority languages in broadcast media based on the needs of national minorities to preserve and develop their identities, And here there is also a role, of course, for independent regulators, um, which are important in this regard. And the state should support balanced programming by broadcasters, as well as facilitating the establishment of and maintenance of media by national minorities in their own language or languages. Um, this should also be regulated, of course, but regulation should not be discriminatory. And minority language broadcasting should not be subject to the imposition of undue or disproportionate requirements for instance, the translation or dubbing or post synchronization or subtitling. Similarly, there should be freedom to broadcast across borders, because very often minorities straddle borders, and there may be so-called kin states or states which have the majority of the population, which is a minority in the neighboring states, who may have an interest in supporting minorities abroad in a positive way through cultural and media cooperation, for instance. Um, and we have worked in the past in Central Asia on following up and trying to render these guidelines more operational. For instance, by having quite a few workshops on explaining these guidelines and having policy discussions with the authorities, for instance, in Kazakhstan, about the issues of subtitling and quotas in broadcasting. The overall aim is indeed to promote linguistic diversity in the media, specifically minority languages, also through the allocation of frequencies, and to provide support for broadcasters themselves to do so. However, and this is important, the existence of so-called minority media should not be a justification to exclude minority language programming from nationwide broadcasting. Very important to accompany this process is also public funding, and here states should at least consider public funding, if possible, for minority media and or capacity building efforts, which can also be provided by donors. In Central Asia, we've seen various examples of donor assistance to minority media, some successful, some less successful, and we can discuss in the next session with the panelists and with conference participants. Then much later in 2012, the HCNM published the Ljubljana guidelines, which are a kind of a summary of all the previous guidelines, and are trying to look at and try to look at a slightly different way of approaching the issues of inter-ethnic relations, not only from a minority rights perspective, but also in a wider sort of structural way, looking at integration as a two-way street. And so the Ljubljana guidelines promote integration policy that encourage also cross-community dialogue and interaction. And the Ljubljana guidelines also remind about the importance of the media in these processes. And in particular, they reassert that state policies should aim to promote and facilitate the capacity and awareness of the media to reflect and to respond to the diversity within their societies, including by promoting intercultural exchange and by challenging negative stereotypes and prejudices, and in other ways counter intolerance. And this is quite topical also for today's discussion. There should also be measures to promote the state or official languages in the media, because that's an important factor for the integration of societies. However, this should not disproportionately curtail the right to use minority languages. The Ljubljana guidelines also goes in quite some detail about the role which the media can have in encouraging cross-community dialogue and interaction based on tolerance and mutual respect. And in this regard, the media should be very attentive to make sure that they reflect the ethnic, cultural, and linguistic diversity of society in their programming for all audiences. And not only devoting like a secondary attention by having only specialized programs for minorities, all of programming of public broadcasters should be as diverse and inclusive as possible. So in this regard, public media have a very important role to play in supporting integration and its understanding by the population. In terms of languages, and in Central Asia, we know that all of the countries in Central Asia are linguistically diverse. It's very useful to promote the state language or other official languages of so-called interethnic communication as a tool for integration. And of course, it's every state has a right to promote the state language in this regard. Um, but of course, there needs to be also an accommodation of minority languages as well, and this should be done in a proportionate way and in a progressive way, so that nobody is left behind in this process. A couple of years ago, we realized that the media environment had changed a lot, obviously, and therefore we decided to not only to up with that the we decided for the latter, and the documents complement each other actually, um, because over the years, of course, we have seen the rise of different kinds of digital platforms. The way we watch TV has changed completely. Many young people no longer watch TV at all. They watch information on social media, and therefore it was very important to make sure that the HCNM thematic guidelines and recommendations also reflected this change. And the Tallinn guidelines, and I will provide a link to them, and I encourage you to read them, also deal with the delicate balance which needs to be struck between, on the one side, the freedom of expression and of the media, and on the other side, the need to counter hate speech. The Tallinn guidelines go in quite a lot of detail, looking at how to promote an enabling environment for the freedom of expression and media freedom. So reasserting those principles, but also giving examples on how they can be better operationalized to promote a better and more inclusive media environment uh, according to the principles of pluralism and diversity. And it has a whole section devoted to how media, as well as information technologies, can contribute to conflict prevention. And this is very topical also for today's discussion. In particular, if you look at the fourth part of the Tallinn guidelines, you can look at the recommendations there, which are that states and other public actors, such as broadcasters, should refrain from disseminating, supporting, or endorsing any kinds of disinformation, propaganda, or inflammatory discourse, which could undermine friendly relations among states, but also generate hostility towards particular groups in society, including national minorities. And this is also valid for internet intermediaries or service providers as well, of course. And this is a huge debate, which is a global one, on how one also moderates somehow content on social media. Um, of course, the balance is a difficult one, because states may restrict or prohibit expression, but they should only do so in strict accordance with international or European human rights law. This means that any restriction on the right to freedom of expression should be based in law, obviously, and should be only necessary and proportionate to achieve a legitimate aim. Any prohibition of freedom of expression should be proportionate in summary, and there should be no blanket kinds of restrictions by the state, because that's unhelpful. And it should only address the most obvious and problematic cases. For offensive or harmful types of expression which do not have a sufficient gravity or intensity to be restricted under international law, one could actually have all kinds of alternative responses to simply restricting them, such as counter speech or intercultural dialogue in the media as well as on social media, and education. We speak a lot about media literacy, and we should have also more social media literacy, as well as all kinds of awareness raising activities. And here again, there's also a role for internet intermediaries in making sure that there is no gender-based violence, for instance, propagated, and that there should be resources allocated for educational campaigns to prevent any kinds of violence. The states, of course, should also support such initiatives and encourage the media without encroaching on their editorial independence to do so. The time guidelines go into slightly more detail, but of course, it remains still a little bit philosophical. And of course, it's always important to try to contextualize these recommendations in a particular situation. And here it's going to be interesting to discuss with you all how to best do that in your respective countries. Over the last more than 6 months, unfortunately, we are faced with a new challenge, COVID-19. We shouldn't overestimate it or underestimate it, but nonetheless, it impacts our lives in more ways than one. And here, the media has an extremely important role to play, and we've seen the different debates of opinion between science and politicians, and which has led to some polarization, unfortunately. And here, from the perspective of the High Commissioner on National Minorities and its office, we actually issued, well, the former High Commissioner Lamberto Zanetti issued specific recommendations to streamline diversity and to make sure that COVID-19 measures actually support social cohesion. Because our point of view is that a stronger society is also more capable to deal with such threats and to grow in a positive manner. So these recommendations are also posted on our website. And with regard to the media, they underline the importance of access to the media by all groups in societies, especially when states issue special measures to reduce the spread of COVID-19. It is essential that everyone in society can comprehend what is expected of them in a language that they can understand. Because there is a risk that information spaces could be misused to spread rumors or misinformation, or even to incite ethnically based hatred. We know from history that at the time of the plagues or even other scourges in ancient history, that very often minorities can be scapegoated for somehow being responsible for the pandemic, which is of course ridiculous from a scientific point of view, but has been used unfortunately for political aims. And therefore, we are trying to grapple with this all together, and it's going to be very important also to get your feedback on how the media and minorities can somehow survive and learn the lessons from this pandemic. Now, with regards to the particular sub-questions addressed to this panel, I would agree certainly that certain groups, including minorities, are still underrepresented in the mainstream media, not only in Central Asia, but pretty much everywhere, actually. And yes, it is true that sometimes certain states or politicians can be afraid that the promotion of minority identities can be controversial, and therefore they want to regulate them. We understand this point of view. However, if anything, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the fore the importance of balanced reporting, which is representing diversity in society without any racial or ethnic bias. So I very much, from the perspective of our office, I very much agree with the main statement which has been put to this panel. What are the specific challenges in a region like Central Asia? And are media by minorities a solution? I would say definitely yes. Of course, the space for minority media, as the space for the media in general, has had its ups and downs in the region. And but there also have been some successful stories of bottom-up examples of where minorities have gotten together and established their own media. But sometimes this has been only due to intervention by donors. And as soon as a donor leaves and goes on to another crisis in another part of the world, sometimes these projects then fail. And this is a real pity. So we need also to be looking at sustainability issues. Here, I tend to think that donor assistance is very important, but as long as there is no real desire from the bottom up for media by minorities to be established, then it's difficult to actually build on this. But of course, even more important, there needs to be an enabling environment out there to support these processes. And here I would agree that independent regulators have an important role to encourage more proper media representation of minority groups and a fair reflection of cultural diversity, both in public media but also in ways to support private media as well. Now, the last question asked to the panel is whether this should be left to the media or journalist associations and self-regulation. As much as possible, yes, because we want to avoid undue interference. Again, it's a delicate balance of all of these matters, and I think you are better placed than I am to discuss the particular questions which are at the top of your minds with regards to your specific countries, regions, and situations. And I will be very happy to engage in the question and answer session as well as in the discussion with you. Thank you very much.